Normandy, summer 1944. A lone American tank sat pinned in a hedgerow as Panthers closed in from the left and Tigers from the right. Outgunned, outmaneuvered, seconds from destruction. The crew braced for the end. The German tankers moved in, certain of an easy kill. But before their guns could finish the job, the sky ripped open and a thunderous strike came screaming down. What the 404th Fighter Group unleashed that day didn't just save a single Sherman, it sent shockwaves through the entire German armored force. And this was only the beginning. That sudden show of air power was a glimpse of what the Allies were preparing on a far greater scale. The breakout we now know as Operation Cobra. The 404th Fighter Group wasn't built to win tank duels. Their war was fought in the skies, yet their firepower would soon prove just as decisive on the ground. For the American tank crews driving the M4 Sherman, that support was a lifeline, because on their own, the Shermans were in trouble. German crews had a cruel nickname for them, the Ronson or Tommy Cooker, because once hit, they tended to burn. And to a large extent, the Germans were right. Against the Panthers and Tigers, the M4 was outclassed. Its 75mm gun bounced harmlessly off thick German plates. Its thin armor could be punched through from long range, and when penetrated, the result was often catastrophic. Facing a Tiger head-on meant only one thing: destruction. While later models introduced wet stowage to mitigate this danger, the tank's reputation for being easily destroyed and quickly igniting remained unchanged. If the Sherman was such a death trap, why then did so many survive? How did the American Tank Division manage to push across France, Belgium, and into the heart of Germany, despite being outgunned and ill-equipped against the Germans? The answer is simple. They had help from above. The help from above was in the form of a P-47 Thunderbolt, manned by the 404th Fighter Bomber Group. This group was born in the summer of 1943, at a time when the United States was preparing for the biggest air-ground invasion in history. At the time, the foundational requirements for a highly effective close-air support unit were heavily championed by influential ground commanders like General George S. Patton, who continued to mount pressure for air assets to defend against the German armies. However, it was Colonel Carroll W. McAlpin who eventually took command of the rugged P-47 in 1944. Their mission was clear: support the troops on the ground, no matter the cost. When the Allies planned the Normandy invasion, the 404th Fighter Group, also a part of the 9th Air Force, was the first to be called upon as a decisive hammer to crack the German armored shield. The flying artillery, the P-47 Thunderbolt, a 3-fighter squadron, 506th, the 507th, and the 508th were all part of the 404th Fighter Group, responsible for the massive, rugged fighter bomber, nicknamed the Jug. These pilots became the absolute worst nightmare for every German tanker on the Western Front. For every flaw the Sherman possessed, the P-47 was its perfect, powerful counterpoint, which could deliver massive destruction on targets in just minutes. This heavy artillery punch was also designed to withstand hostile terrain, allowing it to dive straight through the enemy's camp, absorbing the same heavy flak and small arms fire that often crippled the Shermans and other lighter tanks. Each P-47 is equipped with 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns and even bombs that sometimes weigh up to 2,500 pounds. But this machine didn't rely on machine guns and bombs alone. It carried up to 10 5-inch high-velocity aerial rockets. The HVARS, as they were sometimes called, could deliver such a powerful force, capable of shattering the Germans' prized Tiger tank and even penetrating the Panthers' top armor with ease. When the 404th joined the war after D-Day, their focus was on Normandy. With Sherman's crew trapped, it was just a matter of time before the Thunderbolts stepped in. Rockets blew off the top armor of the German Panther and Tiger tanks with ease. Bombs could flip them on their sides. Even heavy strafing runs could disable engines and tracks. The German crews had to bail out under fire. Pilots flew so low they clipped treetops, unleashing rockets into convoys at point-blank range. At some points, they had to break away sharply to avoid tall watchtowers. One pilot recalled, "You could see the tank commanders looking up, helpless as you dove. That was the moment you knew you had them." Waves of P-47 assaulted German positions, tanks, and artillery. Around Rancy, the P-47 destroyed a German column of 122 tanks, 259 other vehicles, and 11 artillery pieces. The P-47s and the Sherman complemented each other, with the P-47s leaving the once invulnerable Panthers as smoldering wrecks, while the Sherman relentlessly pushed forward. Together, they became the spearhead of the breakout. The effect was devastating. German tank crews, once confident in their Panthers and Tigers, began glancing upwards as often as they scanned the hedgerows. Every distant roar of an engine overhead carried the threat of annihilation. German after-action reports admitted that their tanks could rarely maneuver under constant air attack. A Panther platoon moving in daylight risked being destroyed before even reaching the front line. Soldiers spoke of hiding their armor in barns, under trees, or even covering tanks with foliage, anything to avoid detection from circling thunderbolts. Although the P-47 was a great weapon, capable of mass destruction, they were notorious for being unreliable in the volatile weather conditions that often plagued Europe. Fog, low-hanging clouds, and heavy rain were bound to keep the P-47s grounded for days. Aside from these, pilots also have limited time to correctly spot and target camouflaged enemy tanks at very high speeds. Meanwhile, the Shermans were produced in large quantities, totaling nearly 50,000 units. Even if the combat loss ratio was as high as 4 Shermans for every 1 Panther, they could easily be replaced faster than the Germans could build their formidable tanks. However, the American First Army didn't rely on sheer luck when dealing with the Germans. Traditionally, calling in air support was a long, stressful process. A request would travel from the Sherman crew commander up to the infantry chain, to Army headquarters, then across to Air Force Command. This could take hours, and by then, the Germans would be long gone, or the Sherman crew would be dead. To override this slow chain of communication, the U.S. forces perfected the use of Air Liaison Parties, ALPS, and their dedicated communications. These parties, often called forward air controllers, were usually a lone officer or small team placed directly within the Sherman and infantry columns. They were usually armed with specialized radios used to communicate directly to the circling P-47 pilots of the 404. The ALPS became the eyes of the JUGS on the ground. Once a Tiger is spotted, the Sherman crew radios the ALP, and the ALP instantly relays the target coordinates, oftentimes with smoke shells to mark the spot. The pilots of the 404th then swoop in and drop their HVAR rockets before the enemies reroute their guns or move to safety. This new level of coordination between air and ground forces changed the course of the campaign, and nowhere was this transformation more evident than in what came next. Operation Cobra, July 25, 1944, was the beginning of what the American First Army tagged Operation Cobra. Cobra was the first major shockwave from the American camp that ripped through the German high command. After weeks of close combat in the Normandy hedgerows, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, the commander of the 1st U.S. Army, was determined to create large gaps in the German front lines and weaken their defense. The plan was simple in design but massive in scale. He was going to take advantage of the distraction of the Germans by the British and Canadian attacks around Caen, particularly in another operation called Operation Goodwood, which had drawn the Germans and their armor eastward. And once the German defenses are broken, the First Army would then be able to advance into Brittany, rolling up the German flanks once free of the hostile terrain and cutting off retreating divisions. The operation was meant to be a massive attack on the Normandy front, followed by an aerial bombardment. More than 3,000 Allied aircraft, including heavy bombers and the dreaded fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force, including the 404th Fighter Group, were unleashed over the German lines. It took them barely 3 hours of throwing wave upon wave of bombs to wipe out villages and eventually the German defensive belts. The after effects were devastating for the Germans. The elite Panzer Division, one of the most experienced armored units in the Wehrmacht, lost hundreds of vehicles and its combat strength within days. The once invulnerable armor of their Panthers and Tigers offered not even the slightest comfort or protection against the P-47. However, the American victory came at a cost. General Bradley had initially approved a safety margin of only 1,200 yards from the front line, believing the highway would guide the bombers accurately. But poor weather conditions interfered with the attack. It resulted in poor coordination of the airstrike, with some heavy bombers arriving late. A day before initiating Operation Cobra, an Allied bomber unintentionally dropped its bomb load 2,000 yards north of the highway, and 15 other bombers followed suit, causing widespread destruction on the American front lines. This friendly fire incident resulted in the death of 25 American soldiers, and about 130 soldiers were wounded. Bradley's intentions were for the bombers to approach parallel to the highway, but the air planners ignored his orders, changing the flight path to a perpendicular approach to allow more simultaneous hits on the target. Bradley wasn't aware of the change of plans and was furious when he saw the heavy bombers approaching over his First Army troops' heads. Despite the scale of the disaster, Bradley continued the Cobra offensive the next morning, July 25th. The weather still didn't give way, and by this time the death toll was about 100, even claiming the life of General Leslie McNair, one of the U.S.'s highest-ranking officers in Europe, and over 490 American soldiers of the 30th Infantry Division were wounded. Bradley reconsidered forging ahead with his plans, but some officers of the First Army saw through the damage on their end. They observed that the attack was as disastrous on the German defenses, and so regardless of the losses, the offensive forged ahead once the smoke was clear and their enemies were forced to retreat. Within days, the U.S. Army had broken out of Normandy. The road to Brittany was open, and for the first time since D-Day, the German front in the west was collapsing. As the war dragged on, German tankers struggled to maintain ground, and one battle stood out above all others, the Battle of Aricourt. And once again, the 404th Fighter Group proved decisive. Battle of Aricourt. The smoke from the Falaise pocket still hung over northern France, with the Allied forces pressing eastwards. The Germans were retreating, but not without a fight. They fought across the French countryside, ambushing Allied columns wherever they could. Near the Moselle River, the Germans launched a major counteroffensive attack with the intention of rendering a devastating surprise blow against the rapidly advancing U.S. force of General Patton's Third Army in Lorraine, France. The objective was mainly to recapture Lineville and eliminate the U.S. bridgehead over the Moselle River. The German forces, primarily the new 5th Panzer Army, had a significant local superiority in tanks, including a large number of the highly regarded Panther tanks, which were technically superior to the American M4 Sherman tanks. They anticipated a quick and decisive victory. Fortunately, the deteriorating weather was not ideal for the U.S. tactical air forces trying to locate and destroy advancing German armored units. However, the Germans failed to consider that the open, rolling, and often foggy terrain near Aricourt was perfectly suited for the American M4 Sherman crews. The Shermans excelled at using speed and maneuverability and had good radio communication. Leveraging the tactical protocol perfected after D-Day, the Sherman crew members fired smoke shells, making it difficult for the Germans to locate them. Using the terrain to their advantage, the Shermans quickly outmaneuvered the Panthers and hit them on their thinner side or rear armor, and immediately called in an emergency airstrike. They transmitted their coordinates through a forward air controller attached to their column, one of the many air liaison parties now embedded with U.S. ground units. Within minutes, the roar of the 506th Squadron engines filled the sky. The scene was transformed quickly from a devastating counteroffensive to an aerial ambush. With surgical precision, the Jug pilots dove out of the clouds, aiming at the Germans as they ran for cover. Their turret gunners desperately fired at the sky, the U.S. Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division decisively defeated the German forces, inflicting very heavy tank losses, and doing so while suffering only minimal casualties of their own. It proved that a numerically and technically inferior force, when properly led in utilizing superior tactics, communication, and air support, could defeat the vaunted German Panther tanks. In the Germans' reports afterwards, officers complained bitterly that our tanks no longer fight the enemy, they fight the sky. It was a statement that defined the rest of the war in Western Europe. Germany's collapse from radio to rocket. If Operation Cobra had broken the German lines, the Falaise pocket would have destroyed their ability to resist in France. By mid-August, the German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army were already in full retreat, with the American, British, and Canadian forces sweeping across France. Tens of thousands of Hitler's troops, alongside tanks, artillery, and transport vehicles, were trapped in the ever-shrinking corridor between the towns of Falaise, Chambois, and Argentina. In desperation, they sought out means to flee east toward the Swine River. However, U.S. forces under General Omar Bradley, alongside the British and Canadian troops under General Bernard Montgomery, decided to finally close off the Germans' escape routes. To the north, the Canadians pushed southwards from Falaise, and the Americans worked their way up north through Chambois. This was the perfect hunting ground for the 404th Fighter Group. Every road, hedgerow, and even open field became a killing zone. Pilots described the scene as a shooting gallery. The German units were surrounded so tightly that a single salvo of HVAR rockets or a strafing run by the P-47's 8.50 caliber machine guns guaranteed continuous hits. The air was filled with smoke and burning fuel, causing the pilots to rely on landmarks to navigate the terrain rather than controls. The German survivors would later call the main escape route the Falaise Gap, or the Corridor of Death. By the time the Allied forces finally closed the pocket, 50,000 soldiers had been captured, with 10,000 dead. Only about 40,000 German soldiers managed to escape. Many historians considered the attacks ordered by General Omar Bradley as slow. However, the damage inflicted on the Germans was very severe. In a report, General Dwight D. Eisenhower said, "It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh." The powerful Wehrmacht lost hundreds of tanks, including nearly all the Tigers and Panthers stationed at Normandy. The destruction of the Falaise pocket effectively ended the German presence in France and opened the road to Paris, which was liberated within a week. The aftermath: German panic and adaptation. For the first time since the Normandy campaign, the German tanks suddenly found themselves powerless. The Luftwaffe, that is the German Air Force, was all but crippled by the Allied forces. Reports from the German Army Group B, particularly from the Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, described the Allied air attacks as continuous and devastating. To adapt, the Germans began painting their tanks anew with irregular camouflage patterns to put the Allies off. They cut tree branches, tied them to the turrets, and buried the tanks up to their turrets, turning them into improvised bunkers while trying to blend with the hedgerows. But these desperate measures were barely effective against the 404th pilot, who had learned to identify even the slightest glint of metal or shadow of movement. Once a tank was spotted, the tank's fate was sealed. By late August 1944, General Dwight Eisenhower noted that the Allied air power had become an ever-present asset of immeasurable power and the decisive factor of the campaign. The Germans, although troubled, agreed that the Allies had taken over the sky. It was easier when a tank dueled another tank. Against the Thunderbolt or Typhoon, only luck counts. The destruction of the Falaise pocket marked the end of organized German resistance in Normandy. Thousands of tanks, half-tracks, and trucks littered the French countryside. For the 404th Fighter Group, it was their finest hour. But the war was far from over. The Belgian forest lay ahead, as well as the frozen roads of the Ardennes and the famous counterattack known as the Battle of the Bulge. The winter counterattack, the 404th in the Battle of the Bulge. For the Allies, victory seemed within reach. But in late December 1944, the Germans, driven by desperation, unleashed one final gamble. Using the snow and fog as cover, Hitler unleashed Operation Wacht am Rhein, also known as the Battle of the Bulge. The name Wacht am Rhein was a supposedly defensive name given to hide the true agenda of the Germans, misleading any Allied intelligence personnel aware of their plans. Hitler's plan was strongly opposed by two ranking generals who would oversee the attack. They only saw a waste of resources and men with little chance of success. Hitler dismissed all objections, convinced that the elite German forces would easily roll over the battle-scarred American forces in the Ardennes forest. At Hitler's command, thousands of German tanks rolled through the Ardennes, catching the Allies off guard. This was unlike any challenge faced by the 404th Fighter Group. The skies over Belgium were thick with fog and sleet and unfit for low-flying aircraft. Without the support from the skies, the Sherman crews once again found themselves isolated, trapped, and hunted by German armor. This continued for days uneventfully until finally the weather cleared on December 23, 1944. This was the moment the Allies were desperately waiting for. The 9th Air Force scrambled immediately into action from their forward bases in Belgium. The Germans were not prepared for the attack, as their columns were spread thin along the narrow forest roads. Within a few minutes, convoys of tanks, trucks, and fuel carriers were destroyed. The 507th Squadron was credited with destroying over 100 vehicles in a single day. One pilot, Lieutenant Francis Gabreski, became an ace in both air-to-air and air-to-ground combat, attacking enemy armor with unrelenting precision. German crews now found themselves trapped in burning forests, with their armored tanks torn apart by rockets. By early January 1945, it was obvious the German offensive was collapsing. American tankers who had once feared being overrun now advanced behind the same P-47s that had saved them in Normandy. As the 404th tore into retreating German units across the Ardennes, the phrase, "the jugs are coming," became a battle cry of hope among ground troops. By the time the smoke cleared, Hitler's grand offensive lay in ruins, and the Luftwaffe was shattered beyond repair. But nothing illustrated the true, overwhelming reason for American victory better than a single incident that occurred on New Year's Day, 1945. At the American airfield known as Y-34 near Metz, France, home of the 365th Fighter Group, the Hell Hawks, about 16 German Messerschmitt Bf-10-9s swooped in low through the winter fog. Within minutes, 22 Thunderbolts lay burning, 8 more were wrecked, and the sky above was a haze of smoke and falling wreckage. A captured German pilot, still proud, reportedly gestured toward the blazing aircraft and sneered, "What do you think of that?" But his arrogance was misplaced. Within days, factory-fresh P-47s were lined up on the same ramp. The U.S. war machine had replaced every loss almost overnight. It became clear that the Luftwaffe could no longer keep pace, neither with Allied production nor with the sheer resilience that drove it. For the 404th Fighter Group stationed not far away, it was a grim warning and a motivation. If the Germans could still strike that deep, the mission to destroy their armor and supply lines became even more urgent. The Jugs went back to work, hunting tanks, bridges, and convoys, until the German army was finally defeated. Before the Germans' final surrender in 1945, the 404th Fighter Group had flown over 285 combat missions, destroyed 3,000 enemy vehicles, and earned 4 distinguished unit citations. The lessons learned in the hedgerows of France would later shape the helicopter tactics of Vietnam, the A-10 Thunderbolt II Warthog of the Cold War, and even today's drone-based battlefield coordination. General George S. Patton famously said, "The P-47 saved the ground forces of the 9th Army." Historians have since agreed. The 404th and its pilots proved that air superiority meant far more than ruling the skies. It was about controlling the battlefield itself. Even the Germans, in their post-war analyses, admitted the effectiveness of the P-47s. A Wehrmacht report captured after the war stated bluntly, "No tank movement is possible without immediate air cover. Without it, we are destroyed before contact with the enemy." After the war, the 404th Fighter Group was deactivated, but its legacy continued. Many of its pilots became instructors in the newly created U.S. Air Force.